Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart, and apparently I've been cool since middle school spring term in 1991. Here I am at the age of 13 writing for the school newspaper and drawing, and I'm sure my contemporaries at the time thought I was really something. So today's video is about Warhammer Fantasy, nostalgia, and its important connection with me in terms of wargaming, and it being the most important game in terms of getting me playing and where I am today, still painting toy soldiers at the age of 45. But I also wanted to make the video a little bit about the journey as a parent, seeing your children become interested in miniatures and wargaming and how they react, and then a little bit about Games Workshop's Warhammer The Old World, which is upcoming in the future, and how nostalgia makes it very hard to ignore that. Then at the back end of the video, I just wanted to take a few minutes to discuss what we know so far about Warhammer The Old World, what's been mentioned, some of the current rumours, and some of my own thoughts on it. I know some of you might be interested, especially if you come from a similar wargaming background to me. Many of you may well have started with Warhammer Fantasy and have seen this new incarnation heading on the horizon and might be interested yourself. So let's go back to 1991, or if we're going to be totally accurate, Christmas 1990. I received a copy of Hero Quest, and while this wasn't really my introduction to fantasy worlds, it was certainly part of a series of things that undoubtedly led to my geekdom. I was reading Dragonlance, and my mum had read The Hobbit to me years before. I'd watched Ralph Bakski's Lord of the Rings film a couple of times, and I've been brought up on every fantasy film going in the 80s and 90s. I mean, Willow's back on the TV now with a new series. And as many an 80s child, I was scarred by watching Atreyu's horse slowly sink into the mud. That was harrowing. So in the early summer of 91, while on a trip to the newsagent, I was given some money to treat myself to a comic. I opted for White Dwarf 138 instead. I've been grabbed by it because I recognised the Games Workshop logo from the Hero Quest box, and a quick flick through revealed rules for something called Advanced Hero Quest, which I thought I might be able to use with my game at home, and I was sold. And isn't that Clint Eastwood? There were loads of articles that drew me in and gave me that first taste of what a wide range of hobby this could be. 40k was yet to have an impact on me really, but I would follow it later on. There was Confrontation in the magazine, which became the basis for Necromunda later on, and the fantasy armies and the sales pages. And then of course there was also this advert for Warhammer Fantasy Battle 3rd edition. I can still remember the excitement of the new world I was discovering. I think I became glued to that copy of White Dwarf for the next few weeks, adding some more reading, and a brand new next door neighbour and soon to be best friend for the next 5 years, who turned out to have been playing for a year or so. And I soon picked up a copy of Warhammer Fantasy 3rd edition and the Warhammer Fantasy Regiments plastic box set. 60 miniatures in white plastic. It felt like I had the start for 2 armies and not just 10 dudes from 6 different factions. I pored over the rulebook, probably without actually reading many of the rules, loved the coloured pictures from the epic battles towards the beginning of the book, and devoured the hobby guide over and over again in an aim to try and make my miniatures look as nice as the ones in the pictures. They obviously didn't. I soon added the Warhammer Armies book, and then dreaming up countless lists that never came to fruition, but that didn't matter. We played with what we had and we loved it. Of course, other games followed. Pretty much anything GW did was fair game, and a little later, a load of historicals too, but we won't cover those here. By 4th edition, I was a little older, and with a little help of the starter set, along with money from a part-time job at that age, I was able to play something that resembled a proper game, if slightly on the small side, and I absolutely loved it and the hobby. I have the fondest memories of that time. Now, I went off to uni in 1996, and I completely missed 5th and 6th edition and pretty much all wargaming for 10 or more years, as I went off and pretended I wasn't a geek through my 20s. I have some regrets about this now, and maybe that's a topic for another video someday. So fast forward to the late noughties, I'd hooked in my future wife and decided I needed a hobby that didn't come in pints. Like a comfy old pair of jeans, I returned to Warhammer Fantasy, this time 7th edition, mostly playing Dwarves and Empire. Anyone else remember and love these podcasts? As is so common with wargamers, one game system led to another, and there seemed to be a lot of new things around that time, and I drifted away from 8th. I didn't hate it, but I just didn't enjoy it the same way, and I really sort of turned my head to other systems like War Machine and Malifaux for a while. And then Games Workshop decided to end Warhammer Fantasy anyway, with the End Times. Now, I have absolutely nothing against Age of Sigmar, but it's just never captured me in the same way that Fantasy did. I have a feeling that had Warhammer had a 9th edition or 10th and moved on, I'd have returned to it, but as we know, that's not what happened. So then Games Workshop made this announcement in November of 2019. Warhammer The Old World was in early development. This was soon followed by a map, a fairly sparse map, but a map nonetheless. I'll come back with more details about that later in the video, but needless to say, I've been reading the updates, they've slowly been released, while telling myself that I'm never going to do 28mm games that require more than a warband. Fast forward to a few weeks back and I was playing around trying to print some Warmaster Empire from Minirat. You see, the nostalgia for Warhammer World setting is strong, and I hope this would stop me wanting to do it in 28mm. Now, my eldest is often interested in what I'm printing or working on, but he doesn't quite get captured by the small scale stuff as much. So I let him flick through an old Warhammer Fantasy rulebook and some army books while explaining the old world, and he was hooked straight away, but not by what I was printing, more the models and pictures inside the books. So now I have a double nostalgia whammy, not only for Warhammer Fantasy itself, but also from seeing my son get so excited and remembering how much I loved discovering it in the first place myself. As soon as he said he wanted to play, I knew I was in trouble, and after he watched a YouTube battle report with me and was even more excited, I knew it was going to happen. Incidentally, check out Rogue Element Gaming and Barefoot Miniatures for some excellent 6th edition battle reports. So where does that leave us? Well, my son and I are now collecting armies to play some 6th edition Warhammer Fantasy, dwarfs for me and orcs and goblins for him. So why 6th edition, especially as it wasn't one that I'd played before? Some of the older sets are pretty clunky now, especially for the young to learn, and I'd rather not go back to 8th. 7th I liked, but 6th appears to be the most balanced overall, with pretty much all the armies covered before the edition change. It's also quite similar to 7th, which I enjoyed. It's very well supported on social media, there seems to be lots of battle reports springing up, and it seems to have a little bit of momentum behind it. I am aware there are also very good communities for 9th Age, for 8th Ed, and for the Warhammer Armies project. 6th Ed just seemed to be a really good fit for us to learn and me relearn the game together. 8th edition was definitely a consideration, even though it wasn't my favourite, mostly because it was the latest edition, but I did suffer from those really big game ending spells, and the unit sizes had grown so much I just didn't fancy painting all of those miniatures, or making my son play massive horde armies, especially as he'd chosen orcs and goblins. I can only hope the unit sizes are smaller in the old world. So now it's 3D printing dwarf armies from Highlands Miniatures and scouring eBay for orcs and goblins with a bit of printing as well. And I'll have a slow build and paint as a bit of a father and son activity over the course of the next year or so. Then we'll wait and see what the old world brings us and see if we continue to play or whether this is just a nice little adventure for us to have this year. So for those of you who haven't been following along the news, here's a very kind of quick recap. There's some excellent videos out there going into loads and loads of detail with this. And in many ways, this should probably be a separate video, but I didn't really want to spend time doing one and making something that appeared to be a little bit clickbaity. This is just because it relates to my own personal interest at the moment and the project I'm doing with my son. But as I've already mentioned, the old world was announced in November of 2019 by Games Workshop, and it was very cryptic, but all it really said was that the old world was returning. And then we had some maps and things which looked really fantastic. The artwork was done by Louis Sugden, who works on Warhammer TV. There was a little video here which I'm not going to play, which added a few things on, and then you can see some of those first sort of symbols and stuff. So still pretty vague, we didn't really know what was going on. They obviously had lots of questions around it. And then we move on to a little bit more information, and the main one was confirming the square bases. So there was some stuff about Kislev, and we got people talking about what armies may be involved, and then we had a few questions that were confirmed that the bases were definitely going to be square and that it was going to be the same scale as before, so nothing smaller. They weren't redoing Warmaster, and were the rules going to be new or a rehash of 8th edition, that they would be new and they would be a bit of a mix of all the best bits of all the previous editions. And then the names, you see that's pretty self-explanatory there. Orcs or Aurochs, they'll be returning to the original names because it is the old world, the world that was, so to speak. Then repeating it again, bases, are you sure? Definitely square. So we are looking at something that resembles more Warhammer that we knew rather than Age of Sigmar. I think the news slowed down a bit. It definitely wasn't something you saw more than a sort of 3, maybe even 6 monthly basis, and I probably missed some of the diaries here. But we got some maps of the old world, this time focusing on Britannia, some new heraldry, some talk about orcs and things and elf enclaves, and you get the idea that most of the factions you were used to before were going to be covered, but it was going to be slightly different this time around. Up to the more recent updates, and I will have missed some stuff out. So this was from October last year. There was talk about orcs, Bretonnians and Tomb Kings. Some new art was shown off, which was really, really cool, but very much, in my opinion, old Warhammer Fantasy styling. And then that brings us on to the latest of the development diaries, and we find out that Rob Alderman has taken over at the helm of running the show. So Rob has headed up the Middle-earth strategy battle game for a while and was then given Blood Bowl to look after as well. And he's, I don't know how he's received in the Blood Bowl community, but I don't hear any bad rumours, but he's very, very well received in the Middle-earth strategy battle game community. He's a good egg, he's a good bloke. So based on that and my own experiences of playing that game, I'm pretty happy that he's looking after this game that I used to love so much. And they talk a little bit about the setting, and that they weren't going back to the timeline that was before, that the world still was destroyed, but they're taking it back a few hundred years. So it's still recognisable as Warhammer Fantasy, but it means they can play around with some things that happened in the timeline that they haven't explored before. So we're not going to be close to the end times. We're going back to just before the Great War of Chaos and the Siege of Prague. And we're looking at a period where the Empire wasn't one single entity, still separated into its various kingdoms at the time. And I really like that. It gives some opportunity to them to expand an area of lore which they haven't covered before, and gives them room to do new things, which would have been very, very awkward if they just returned to that kind of 2 minutes to midnight setting which had always been covered. Now, the internet and YouTube itself is full of videos based on guessing and rumour and conjecture, and you either hate that stuff or you love it. I tend to sit somewhere in the middle. Sometimes it really annoys me, and other times if I'm excited about something, it's fun to go and listen to the rumours, but as long as you take those things with a pinch of salt, and then you won't go too far off track. Now, if you are potentially interested in Warhammer The Old World, there are plenty of videos online where you can go and listen to all those rumours and hear people talking about it. It's mostly people that are just excited for the game and want to talk about it, a bit like I'm doing now, but there isn't too much to talk about, so there is a lot of guessing and conjecture and things like that. Some of it's a little bit clickbaity, but choose the ones you're interested in and avoid the ones that would annoy you, I would say. In truth, nobody really knows yet what we're going to have or when it's going to be. In 2023, it is 40 years of Warhammer. That's not just Warhammer Fantasy, it's Warhammer Roleplay as well. So Games Workshop may well have wanted to release this game this year. It seems to be a logical thing, but we also know that they had a lot of delays during COVID, and many, many releases were pushed back a long way. So it wouldn't surprise me if it wasn't till next year. I think we'll get quite a lot of news this year, potentially see some new miniatures and get a really sort of solid idea about what to expect, but I don't think we'll get a game this year, and I think that will be down to COVID delays and the backup that that's caused. Now, what will we get? Loads and loads of rumours around this, and most of the conversation at the moment seems to be about a new big starter box with Tomb Kings and Bretonnians. Who knows? Who knows? I'm pretty confident we'll get a nice big book. You can expect that. We have to remember that this game is coming from the Forge World / Specialist Games side of the business, not the main Warhammer, AOS and 40k studios. So I think it's worth looking at how they manage Necromunda, Horus Heresy and Middle-earth Strategy Battle Game, and Blood Bowl as more of a clue as to the way these might be released. The latest rumours around that Tomb Kings and Bretonnian starter set might make a bit of sense in the sense that many of those miniatures are old and most dated compared to some of the other ranges and didn't really have many updates in the 7th and 8th edition periods. Knights for the Bretonnians are pretty old looking. I'm not sure which edition they were made in. Potentially that was your 5th edition starter set. Someone may be able to correct me there. So they definitely have a few years on them, though the peasants and some of the other sculpts are very, very nice and hold up pretty well. I think we need to think about whether this will have the same format as before, and think about the size of the old Warhammer game and whether that would work. I can't, for me, see a system where we're going to have one big rule book and 10, 12 army books for all the different factions that were around, or most of the factions that were around. I just don't see the size of the Forge World stroke specialist game studio being able to manage that. I think that would be far too much, and if they did go down that route, we may be waiting a decade for some of the army books to come out, which I know would have just annoyed people. I think it's most likely we'll see some kind of Ravening Hordes style army book. We had that before in early editions and 6th edition most recently. I say recently, that was back in 2000, but when that game launched there was a complete reset and there was a get you by army list booklet with enough for all the factions. And I suppose we've seen it more recently when 40k went to 8th ed with the indexes. I suppose we can also look to Middle-earth strategy battle game that when the latest edition launched, we had Armies of the Lord of the Rings and an Armies of the Hobbit books, which gave you the core rules and stats for each of the main factions. The question for me would be, how permanent are these Ravening Horde style army books? Will there be a free PDF online so that anyone can grab their old Warhammer Fantasy armies and get playing straight away? A little bit like when Age of Sigmar first launched and there were war scrolls for all of your old miniatures and you were encouraged to play the game with your square bases just to give it a try. That could be the case, but it's also possible that they go to a semi-permanent kind of index system like we saw with Warhammer 40k, or we have a completely permanent system where there is a rule book and then a couple of set army list books which break the factions down into good or evil or order or destruction or something like that, and then future profiles could be added with campaign supplements just like it works in Middle-earth strategy battle game. Now I think that would work really well and it would be something that I'd like. And this also works really, really well with Horus Heresy, with big chunky books with multiple army lists in, and then with the ability to add new things later on through later publications. This would also work well with a limited miniature release, and we'll talk about the miniatures next. So the miniatures, how will it work? I think it's pretty clear that many of the old fantasy miniatures are still available for Age of Sigmar, and many of them have been updated and have slightly new style sculpts, but one of clearly things that were available or around during the world that was. Obviously some factions are missing more than others and some things are hidden away a little bit, but for example if you search Cities of Sigmar in the AOS section, you'll find the core of an Empire army there and a good chunk of a Dwarf army, even if it's missing its most basic of warriors. It's not impossible that they try and separate some of the newer sculpts that have been designed for Age of Sigmar and not use them for Warhammer The Old World, especially if some of these miniatures are required to rank up on square bases. They may well not fit, but who knows, we're just going to have to wait and see with those. Hell, they may even up the base sizes, which no doubt will cause some rage with people who have existing armies, but it wouldn't be impossible, I suppose, to have 20mm squares replaced with 25mm, and I'm sure at launch all base sizes would be allowed, but slowly people will want to move towards the, in inverted commas, standard, just like we saw with Age of Sigmar with people playing on squares to start with, moving over to rounds later on. If I'm honest, I think what we'll see is a return of many of the older plastics, repackaged, probably in the plain and white packaging they used and sold under the banner of the Old World. And there'll be many things from the Age of Sigmar line which you know you can also dip into as well. And then I think they'll add a smattering of new sculpts, some plastic, but most of it resin through Forge World. This just makes sense. You either have a very limited game with only 2 or 3 factions of brand new stuff, or you cater for many factions, which is clearly what people are expecting, and you have to bring the old stuff back. Take a look at the Middle-earth strategy battle game range, and you've got miniatures there that date right back to the launch of the game, and they're still good and they hold up. Some people complain and say they want new sculpts, but the reality is plastic tooling is expensive, and the budgets that these departments are given to run these subsidiary games, because let's face it, 40k and Age of Sigmar are currently the biggest ones, are probably a little bit lower, so they spend that money on new characters and shiny things. So again, I think looking at the model for Middle-earth strategy battle game with old miniatures still in production, some old metals and fine cast maybe even brought back as made to order, and then an addition of new heroes with new profiles. One thing you can be sure is whatever they do will be wrong in the eyes of some people. Well, if you've made it to see my face again at the end of this video, you have done very well. It was definitely probably 2 videos in one about the nostalgia of Warhammer Fantasy and finding that same kind of connection and things with my son, which is something I'm really enjoying at the moment. The second half was obviously a little bit chatty about a game that I'm excited about that's coming in the future, but I know that some of you watching it are a bit like me, really, who have kind of seen it in the background coming from Games Workshop and wondering whether they're going to be interested or be able to ignore it themselves. And over the last few weeks and months and things, I've kind of discovered as much as I wanted to, I probably can't ignore it. I'd love to hear what you're thinking about with Warhammer The Old World. I know a lot of you on this channel have nothing to do with fantasy or science fiction gaming at all, but I also know that many of you would have started there or have played it in the past, even if you no longer do now. So I'd be really interested to find out whether you think you're going to be tempted in, whether it's something you're definitely going to avoid, or you're not sure. Either way, it'd be really cool to hear about what your thoughts are on it. What would it mean for the channel? Not much at all, to be honest with you. I'm not going to be doing a project vlog on Warhammer Fantasy stuff. There will be painting tutorials, but that's always a plan for this channel, doing what I do for a living. So there will be painting tutorials based around fantasy miniatures. I'd plan to do that anyway, but I'll be keeping the most of the project and the gaming side as something between me and my son, really. It's actually going to be extra hobby time rather than taking up too much of the hobby time I was planning on for the other things on the channel. So you've got nothing to worry about too much there. I will do updates. I'll obviously do videos when I've painted units and things like that, but I'm not going to do any kind of significant vlog series as it stands. When it comes to launch time of the old world, we'll see what happens there, but right now it's going to be something a bit cool I enjoy with a bit of gaming with my son, a bit of slow grow, and I'll share some painted toys every now and then. So thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you are new, do check out the other videos on the channel. If you're here for Warhammer Fantasy, you'll know that it's pretty slim pickings for that at the moment. But as I said, there will be some painting videos on there, and there may be more to follow next year as and when the game launches, as and when there's news. If you've enjoyed the video, please do consider giving it a like. It does help other people see it. And if you like what you see on the channel, consider subscribing so you can catch future videos. Thanks very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.